Hjertelig.
A warm welcome. My volume is turned up, I can hear. Let me try to get started. And the reason why you see me here is that I'm going to transition from being the Executive Vice President of the European Commission to another chapter of my life. And this is an attempt to ease that transition, being a moderator here today. In any case, a warm welcome to all of you. It's nice to see those of you who are present here in the room, and also a warm welcome to those of you who we cannot see who are with us online. And if you are not a Danish speaker, then you can listen to the English interpretation today. Those of us who work in the European democracy are used to listening to simultaneous interpretation into 23 languages, and that is the way we do conferences as well. So of course we appreciate the opportunity to work in our maternal language. Also, welcome to Aarhus for those of you who have traveled here. I mean, can't we just call it the City of Smiles again? I mean, I know that the city was just awarded the prize for being the most livable city in the world, and therefore it's an obvious place to hold this conference. This is the fifth debate, the fifth version of our Markets for People conference. We have been to Salamanca, Salzburg, Modena and Brno. It's the European Commission and DG Competition who are hosting these conferences. And what we would like to speak about is the role that competition policy plays in the market to us as people and as consumers. It might be a bit complex and technical. There's an entire sector of competition attorneys who make a living making sure there are billable hours in making it technical and complex. And does that mean that competition authorities can just isolate themselves? Maybe they're too close to companies, maybe they're too far away from companies, maybe they don't really know how to make competition work for us in our everyday lives. So we would like to demystify what competition policy is, but we also would like to discuss what role it can play. And this is not a conference where we are going to listen to pros or cons, because getting rid of competition is not an option. It's unrealistic. I mean, the Olympics are coming to Europe this summer, and that is also a competition. We don't want to get rid of competitions altogether. So this is not a polarizing conference where you are either against or for competition. The aim is to give rise to a discussion of what industrial policy means, what subsidies mean, how should we handle cooperation between companies when it comes to the green transition, for instance, because every once in a while it can be a good idea that companies help each other out in this transition. As you can see on this poster illustrating the conference, it is nothing new that we organize markets in Europe where people can sell their products. One person can sell potatoes and another person can sell potatoes next to him, and they will figure out internally how to sell them at a reasonable price. But ever since the birth of markets, we have also been trying to figure out how to regulate this competition. So we hope that we will have an interesting debate this morning. What has been my job the past 10 years is to make sure that markets are open, that competition is fair, and that it depends on your business idea and your work ethics and your capital whether you can reach your potential customers or not. And sometimes in the discussion and in the debate leading up to the elections for the European Parliament, is a discussion of whether we should have industrial policy or competition policy. And just to spoil that whole discussion, I can tell you that my conclusion is that we need both. But we can never do without competition policy and law enforcement, because that would render many of the other things we do less efficient. So first and foremost, it is my task to welcome you today. First of all, we are going to hear from Pro-Rector Eika, and then I will welcome the panel, and we will have a few rounds of questions with the panelists before opening up the discussion to this room and also to our participants online. The idea is to hear from academia, from business, from media, and also we're going to hear from someone who is enforcing competition law. But first and foremost, I would like to welcome our host today, Pro-Rector at Aarhus University. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Aarhus University. And welcome to today's debate about European competition policy. It is almost 250 years ago since Adam Smith gave rise to the idea about the invisible hand. He envisaged how the free market almost magically created a balance between supply and demand. There is still a lot of respect around Adam Smith and his ideas. Nonetheless, we have realized that the dream of the free competition and the free market is very difficult to realize. Even today, in the year 2024, markets and supply chains have become more and more complex. What is written in small print is more difficult to read. And both as companies and as consumers, it can almost be impossible to understand laws, rules, and guidelines in the analog world as well as the digital world. So the free market might not be as free for everyone. And if the open competition is not entirely open, and if consumers are not entirely protected, then the short question is, should the invisible hand be wearing a glove? Is it the European Commission that should bear that role? And how would they assume that role? These are some of the questions that I think we might cover today. It's an important debate for us all. And thus I'm very happy that Aarhus University will be able to host this debate. I would like to thank the European Commission for dropping by. I would like to thank the Vice President for the European Commission, Margrethe Vestager, who will act as moderator today, and I would like to thank the 4 panelists for participating today and shed light on the discussion about the invisible hand. Enjoy. And we corrected one of my first errors as a moderator. I didn't present myself. My name is Margrethe Vestager, and I am the Vice President, the Executive Vice President of the Commission. And I would like to initialize the debate. But first of all, I would like to set the principle for the invisible hand and whether or not it should be wearing a glove. We have 4 panelists, and they are not afraid to step up. Most of them are known for all of you who are here today. The first one is Michael Svarer, who is a professor at the Department of Economics at Aarhus University. Then we have Jakob Hald, who is the Director General, Danish Competition and Consumer Authority. We have Nina Munch-Perrin, anchor at the National Broadcasting Network, DR. And we have Sofie Carsten Nielsen, Director for European Biosolutions Coalition. A round of applause for all of them, please. How amateur-like. I should have controlled everything, and I should have known where to sit. But that also shows who we are, and that everything is based on trust. Everything will be all right. We know each other, and if somebody is cheating, then somebody will come after them and say it to somebody's mother, because that's not too good. But can we rely on that? Perhaps if we start with you, Michael. That's a very broad introductory question. You're an independent scholar in our societal development. You base your research on facts, and could you please try to address the title of the debate? Competition policy. Could we do without? It's something relatively new in Denmark to have a competition policy.
If we look out the window today, the sun is shining. This is the most beautiful university in the world. And if we look at the Danish economy, then it's looking beautiful as well. We're one of the most wealthy countries in the world. We're one of the happiest countries, the most equal countries. We're one of the countries where it's the easiest to do business, according to the World Bank. So we have a very well-functioning economy. And what competition needs to do is to contribute to these exact things, to high efficiency. And what competition does is that you should compete for resources. If you want to attract labor, capital, property, you have to compete for it with your competitors. And the more competition you have, the more efficiently you can utilize your resources. And then when you use resources, you need to go to market in a proper way so that you make sure that the difference between the price of the resources and the price you get isn't too big. If you can transfer some of that price to the consumers, then there's a bigger share for the workers. And this share of capital hasn't increased in Denmark compared to other places. So we're doing well. But can we thank competition laws for that? And the answer is no, because the competition law is only 25 years old, and Denmark has been one of the world's most wealthy countries for centuries. So we can do without competition law, but competition law emphasizes what we want to do. We want to ensure that the things that are working well in Denmark continue to work well. And that is what Jakob needs to do in Denmark, and that is what you are doing in the EU for some time still. But we've also created a situation where we have managed to do without competition law in Denmark, but it's important that we maintain this status. And what Berit Eika, she talked about Adam Smith, and as an economist, I'm very happy to hear a Pro-Rector mention Adam Smith. Then we have been successful as economists. But what she says, and what you're saying as well, is that we can't just keep moving on, because we are seeing increasing steps to limit competition. There's an increasing wish across countries to introduce protectionist measures to limit competitions. And are there any good reasons for that? Well, yes, there might be good reasons for limiting competition, even though as an economist, we like a free market. I don't know how much speaking time I have. Normally, I will speak for 45 minutes at a time here at Aarhus University. But is that counting down or up? No, it's just to reassure you. There's a watch up here, because Michael might keep speaking for 45 minutes, but you have less than 5 minutes left. Okay. Well. But of course, if we look out into the world, and we're going to talk more about that, I'm sure, there's a big wish to limit competition within countries, across borders, and globally. And if we look at what has been happening when it comes to protectionism, for instance, in the US, when Trump became president, he tried to limit some of that competition. And the argument is that China is against us. And another argument is that if you have strong competition, there is also a lot of disruption and a lot of change in society, and that comes with a cost, because those who are not good at competing, those who are not competitive, they will be left behind. And then they get mad and they start to stir up some trouble, and that's not good for the cohesiveness of our society. So how do we strike a balance between a strong competition so that we utilize resources well, but at the same time distributing the benefits and the employment and so on. And we have seen a wish for more in protectionism for a while now, and that also goes for industrial policy that you touched upon and that I would like to get into more later. And the question here is how to find the optimum balance between creating efficient markets, but also at the same time protecting the parts of society that are affected by this competition, that we opened up to global competition. And of course, the income increase that we have seen in Denmark and in the world the last 100 years has been phenomenal. I mean, my kids are 100 times more wealthy than my grandparents when they were their age, and that has happened within the course of a century. And we have achieved that by globalizing the economy, by trading freely with each other. But now we are seeing strong forces trying to introduce more protection. And it's very interesting to discuss where the right balance is so that we maintain the opportunity to make use of these opportunities, but at the same time ensuring that it doesn't go too fast. Because if you end up with societies that are not cohesive, it's not good for the development of welfare either. So it's a very interesting question, and I will stop here before my time is up. Excellent, and that is what I see in my work as well. That for most of us, the benefits of competition is something we don't really notice. But the downsides, those who are affected negatively by competition, they really notice because their business might have to close. In Brussels, just next to the house where one of my employees lived, they did a survey trying to figure out what people think about competition. And they asked a baker in the area, what do you think about competition? And she said, well, luckily we don't have any competition here. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. And Sofie, you represent industry today, and the Confederation of Danish Industry in particular, but it doesn't mean that you only trade with Danish companies within our own country. So what is really your perspective here? Because I'm sure some members of the Confederation of Danish Industry that you represent will think, how are we ever going to compete against these multinationals around the world? And are the benefits really worth the downside? So should the hand be gloved to a greater extent in order to stay in this industry policy?
It's definitely necessary at times, but we also have to find the right balance. But I want to speak for the competition policy on behalf of Danish companies, because when competing, and it's been going well in Denmark for many years, but what has happened is that everything can cross borders in an instant. And that might be goods, services, and everything that comes to mind that we can produce. And none of my members working with Biosolutions, none of them are only operating in Denmark. The market is too small. Even if it's a company with only 2 people, they will immediately think, how do we sell to the world on a global scale? Because that is the market for them. So the better and freer competition we have in the world, the better it is for companies, and the more transparent it is, the better. So we really need what is called the level playing field. We need transparent, proper rules and guidelines for competition. But we also need a framework. And that framework, when we cross borders and we're not just being in the market in Denmark, where we trust each other and we don't actually need rules, because it is, of course, easier when you don't have to comply with a lot of rules. But when you cross the borders, it's important to have rules that we all understand. We need them to be uniform, and we need them to be relatable, and we need that glove on the invisible hand to be able to set that framework. Sometimes we also need that the people wearing the glove will look back at what was decided before them, because it was a different time with other prerequisites, when other things made sense. In Europe, I would say the agricultural policy, it made sense that we had a common agriculture policy when we needed food enough for all of us right after the Second World War. Now we have a different framework where we need different solutions concerning food, because there are a lot of aid schemes that need to be transparent, and they might support people emitting more gases. And sometimes you have to switch so that you're wearing the glove on the other hand. And that leads me to you, Nina Munch-Perrin. Because the public opinion is affected by you and what we have decided to bring to them today. And until now, we've emphasized the balance between where is the pain point and where is the benefits in all of this. And if I know the news stream, then they normally tend to say that everything is rosy, everything is going well. And as a colleague of mine said, we perfectly know what to do, we just don't know what to do afterwards. So how do you handle this in a media perspective, that we have this debate?
Well, first and foremost, it's true. We don't report much about things going to plan. When the trains and planes are on time, there's nothing really to report. So we won't see that in the news stream. That is our role, of course. And Margrethe, I will get back to your question, but first of all, let's tap into the fact that as media, we're our front row audience to the transitions that we are seeing. Sofie talked about how the invisible hand should be given a different glove from what we have seen before. And Michael said that fortunately his kids are 100 times more wealthy than his grandparents. And in the media world and in this wind tunnel we're in right now, you've been part of this system for 10 years, Margrethe. So let's have a look back at those 10 years. I'm not sure that your children's children will be 100 times richer than you. I'm actually quite sure that they will not be. And I'm sure that the glove on the invisible hand is not really fitting very well. And in the media, we try to report about this, but it's uncomfortable because we need to tell some truths to the European population, and I'm not sure they have really understood. And when I'm invited to things, you know that, Margrethe, I will always say something that is not very diplomatic, but I'm sure that's why you keep inviting me. Because in Europe, we still tend to believe that we are world leaders. We think that our ideals are global. We think that other people should live according to our rules, our competition rules. And the truth is, and that has really exploded the past 10 years, that that is not the case. And we need to find our place in the world again, and Brussels needs to find its place in the world again. And I think it's quite funny, so I like to repeat that the US has the money, they have the venture capital, China has the scalability and the speed, and Europe has the rules. So you do the math and see who will get to the finish line first. It is not us, I can tell you that. The problem is that our children will not be richer than us. We don't have the good jobs. We don't have the good solutions. And as Sofie said, Denmark is a small open economy. We live on trading with others. We cannot do without a big global market, and it has to work. And right now, the playing field is quite new, and the rules of the game are new. And I'm not sure we're ready for that. I might be a bit pessimistic sometimes when I get up in the morning, because I'm not sure whether the European population understands what is hitting us. We should talk about China, India, Indonesia. The US can do something. When they decide something, they just go with it. And we haven't even touched upon the Middle East, which is really a center of power with an extreme amount of wealth. So if they want to be leaders in sports, then they will. They get the Olympics, they get the World Championships. And I see a geopolitical agenda that taps into all of this, where we haven't really woken up yet, unfortunately. Well, now we're starting to set the stage. Can you feel it? So, Jakob, you are part of the competition authority here in Denmark. Now we've had competition law for almost 30 years, and then for the next 30 years we should just transition into becoming a shop that distributes tax money in the most reasonable way possible. Is that the case? Because if that is the concern, that we haven't realized what kind of world we're living in, then what kind of role does competition play, and what kind of role does enforcement of competition rules play? Because Jakob and my colleagues enforcing competition law are becoming more dependent on the power itself. And then it's a good thing if Jakob and his colleagues have a reasonable budget to do their job, and it shouldn't be dependent on whether people like the results of your work. So how do you handle this setup, and how, as an independent competition authority, how can you handle some of the challenges that Nina is mentioning here?
Let me just start somewhere else and then return to the question. First of all, thank you for inviting me here to Aarhus. It's amazing to be here. This is Michael's home turf, and we were talking about squeezing him a bit in this debate, but we decided not to go down that direction. Regarding the competition law, I would say that it is correct that we have developed a competition law that is on the same level as other European laws. And it is true that if we look at the country in a macro perspective, a lot of things are going well. That is correct. But with the Danish Competition and Consumer Authority, we look at the micro perspective. We look at all of these markets, and there are a lot of competition difficulties, and that is across the board. Also, in the part of the economy that is not concerned with international competition. I would also like to say that if we look at the development in Denmark and in other countries, there are also indications that we are going in the wrong direction. We talk about efficient competition, and if we look at the situation in Denmark, we have some targets for the economy as a whole, and if we look at those, we have some large companies who have earned a lot on markets in other countries, and the competition has increased. Another measure that we look at is the conspiracy measure, and we can see that there is a tendency that competition has been weakened in that area. So from our perspective, there is a lot of work, and there are cases that we do not prioritize. So saying that there is nothing to do, that is incorrect. And regarding what Michael said, if we read literature about the effects of enforcing competition laws, the effects are quite grand. I'm very happy to hear that the Confederation of Danish Industries are positive when it comes to competition. And in the future, if we expect support for suggestions that support efficient competition, that would be amazing, because that is not what we've seen the last 20 years. And one last thing, for us, we work with the enforcement of the competition law, but we also work with the provisions of the treaty, Article 101 and 102, and we do it in a collaboration with the Commission, and the collaboration works extremely well. And there is, from my perspective, a common wish to make sure that we enforce the rules in a uniform way across Europe. So we, together with the Commission and other authorities, we are fighting for a good market. We try to make the markets work, to make the competition work, and make sure that people can navigate in these markets. We need better quality, we need better innovation, and it might also give us opportunities to have more products in the markets. And it is worth fighting for, but we can come back to that later on. Thank you very much. Can you feel it? We're warming up now. And of course, there is a question popping up. We have a QR code. It wasn't in the original painting because we've developed so fast these last couple of years, but you can use the QR code and you can gain access to asking questions, because these insightful people, they will also have time to answer your questions. So enter the space with the QR code and you can pose your questions. This landscape that we've painted now with some threats from abroad. Some people are running very fast, some people have a lot of funds, and some people are waiting a bit to see how to act. And we have a single market in Europe that is our own training pitch when it comes to the large global market. We have a financial perspective and we have some societal perspectives. Michael, you will like the floor, but could you talk a bit about the two perspectives? Can we have great financial growth when we see China, who are very competitive in many markets? They are very state-governed, but they use competition in many areas. And they've had an impressive financial growth for many years. But how do you strike the balance when it comes to equality? Because that's the other side of it. And we've been circling around it, and we have different targets also when it comes to climate action. But we can't just let some people get the good jobs and then others will have to get by with the rest of it.
That's a very big question. Well, of course, this is Jutland. We ask big questions. And I'm sure you will give me 10 minutes this time. But let me just address what Jakob said. It's extremely important to have strong competition authorities, of course. And as an economist, we just love competition, of course. And it does work. But it's just a fun observation that you only had a law for 25 years. The Sherman Act in the US was introduced in 1890, which included a ban on cartels. These were antitrust rules, and we're so far behind on these kinds of measures. But you're doing a very good job, and it's not something we notice in our day-to-day work. I didn't know that the law was 25 years old until I listened to your podcast. You do a very good podcast, by the way. But then in the year 2000, if you wanted to acquire your competitor, you had to call Jakob and say, well, we want to acquire all of the other dairies in Denmark. Can we do that? And he would say, no, you cannot do that. I live north of Aarhus, where a lot of attorneys and independent businesses are located. And in 2013, you introduced imprisonment as a sanction for cartels. So that really led some companies to tighten up their ship because nobody wanted to end up in prison. So there's a lot of pressure on the competition in our markets. And then your question is whether we can strike a balance where you have regulation and you still have competition and also growth. And talking about China, I'm not sure that things are going very well in China. Everybody is fleeing from China. It doesn't seem like they really found gold when it comes to finding a balance between communism and competition. But of course, they moved a lot of people out of poverty, and it shifted the entire global income distribution. And we can talk about that afterwards when it comes to agriculture. But I think we need to find a balance. And that also goes to what Nina said. A lot of countries are really introducing subsidies. And then the question is, what is optimal for EU? When Biden introduces the Inflation Reduction Act, which has nothing to do with inflation, but which is all about subsidies for the green transition, and he says you can do all the green transition you want, we will give you subsidies. And then EU says, well, should we do the same? And that's a very interesting question. What is the reasoning for the EU to start giving subsidies to selected companies? Then Jakob and me and you, who have been taught microeconomics, we will say we shouldn't do that. The market should control that on its own. Nobody should do industrial policy because we can't pick the winners. We cannot predict what companies will survive. There was this French-German attempt at creating a browser to compete with Google. It was called Quora. Does anybody use it? I think they put $1 billion into it, but it didn't really succeed. And there are loads of those kinds of examples. So you should really have a good hard think before you go into industrial policy. But there might be good economic arguments for it as well, because the markets are not completely in line with Adam Smith. There's a lot of friction out there, particularly when it comes to startups. How do you convince people that this is a good idea? How do you get over the infant industry problems? You need to get across into the market. You need to create knowledge that can then be used by others. So there's a lot of good arguments for supporting businesses. But when should you take steps, or when shouldn't you? That's why we are very lucky to have a good commissioner in the EU. But what should we do when it comes to Biden and his strategy? What Biden does is that he wants to support the green transition, but you need to be an American company. And of course, that's a bit shady. That kind of challenges our traditional wisdom. In the EU, we should stick to our good principles, that the green transition should be driven by good pricing signals, such as the quota market and the climate policy, and then you should support where the externalities are the greatest, where you can achieve the greatest improvements in the market. If you can find those places, then you can venture into industry policy, but you should be very targeted here. And the US laws are not very targeted. They are a broad spectrum. So I agree, you should take up the glove, but you should do it in an intelligent way. And then, of course, the question is whether that is enough for us to keep up. But the principles are solid. But don't we all also have some experience to draw on here? Because when you're in a lecture hall such as this one, a room without windows, then we often heard how we used subsidy schemes to build wind turbines. In a previous life, I was the energy spokesperson for my party, and we really wanted to subsidize wind turbines, because then that would speed up the development. But instead of asking the politicians how to quantify these subsidies, and instead of doing that, they actually went out and asked the wind turbine producers tell us how much support they really needed, because it turned out they didn't really need that much. And it wasn't a parameter of success that we spent a lot of money on subsidies. The success wasn't that we spent a lot of money on wind turbines. The success was that we spent the sufficient amount to make sure that we accelerated the Danish wind energy sector. So sometimes we shouldn't just go ahead and call everything industry policy, because if you make sure that the dosage is right, then you can really achieve something. And this is directed at you, Sofie. What do you do if the market can't deliver? Because everyone went to Paris and said, we're going to do it, we're going to fight climate change, and it is very urgent. And then people said, well, we can't just do that. We can't just produce steel without using any coal. We can't just produce everything without any emissions. So that gave rise to a discussion of what politicians and authorities can do in order to make sure that the market can actually deliver. And I'm sure you encounter that every once in a while. And we understand that industry is crucial to the green transition, but also that it will take a while. And how do we get there?
Yes, industry is very important for our economy and essential for something happening on the decisions we make. And we will have to include regulators. But the market, and I think that you also said it, the single market is us. And the single market is companies, and companies are us as people. And the regulators are also people. So the dialogue that you were referring to, and what we did in Denmark regarding the wind industry, what is it we should do to make this happen, and what can you give us? We have to initiate that dialogue, and it might be more difficult when it's 27 countries and us, even though we have common rules. And that is where the Confederation of Danish Industries like competition policy. That's when it becomes common. The difficult part is when we have different rules and the small companies need to understand, well, how do we do this and how do we do that in the markets where they produce? It is very complex. So we need to simplify it and make it more uniform, the better it is for companies. But of course, when we don't reach our targets, we will have to think about what are like, and you referred to it as the industrial policy, that we should look back on our experience. And our experience states that we should have a dialogue. It should be a dialogue between companies and regulators in Europe. They should collaborate a bit more to initiate that dialogue, despite cultures and it being across different European borders. And speaking of the geopolitical situation that Nina mentioned, if we don't do it together, we will become very little, regardless of it being Denmark, France, or even Germany. We have to do it together and have that dialogue. And the dialogue is also about the fact that when things go too slow, then how do we speed it up without compromising rules and security? But Danish companies and all the companies that we represent in the coalition, in the Biosolutions coalition, we need to speed things up. And I know that that is annoying to hear for the Commission, but it is going too slow. We could do it in a smarter way, we could look towards the Inflation Reduction Act, because the Americans can continue distributing the money, and we cannot do that in Europe. It might be a good way of doing it, but we have to do things in a smarter way. We have many good ideas in Danish companies that might solve many issues, and they will help us earn money. But we need the ideas to solve the issues and to pay for the welfare in European countries. Nina. Yes, there is no doubt, and my sound is a bit better, so you can hear me better now. Referring back to what I said before, Sofie, you are completely correct. Europe is our community. We have to stand together, and we have a single market. And what was it you called it, Margrethe? It's our training pitch, where we can become better and we can make each other better. And we have good technologies, and we can meet the rest of the world with this foundation. And China doesn't have that. They have a young population and everything is just going very fast. They don't have that many rules. The last time I spoke with people with companies in India, and it wasn't that easy to get technologies out into the world. And when we talk about subsidies, we do have options to give subsidies to people with a good idea. And what I hear when I speak with companies, and I was speaking to Jakob, the grandchild of Hald, a large company that is trying to say that they want to be world leading in the green transition. I think it was one of your members. We were speaking the other day, and I was allowed to use his name today, because they make catalyzers that should support the new technologies, and he's saying everything is going too slow in Europe. But we do have the money. It's the regulations that are too slow. This is a fight. This is a match, and we lost the first half. There's no half time in such a match. We just have to keep up. And if we go back to the United States, they have the money and they are just going full speed ahead, and something is working for them. And then we have China. We can all agree that's a horrible place. I've been there many times. You have as well. They have solar panels. They have electrical vehicles. They're all Chinese produced nowadays. So many products, and I don't know what India will bring to the table, but something they will bring. They have a lot of technologies that is being coded in India. And in the meantime, we're sitting here, and our strength is community. We have to stand together and figure out how competition policy will play for us and how it will work for us. And Jakob, that leads me to a question that you might reflect upon. I understand that you're doing it very well, and it's very good for the consumers that you make sure that things aren't too pricey and that there aren't illegal cartels. But on your desk, when you go to work in the morning, is it just competition enforcement and free competition that is of interest to you? Or do you also think about the greater good? And one small example from my own world and the media industry, which is under a lot of pressure from the large tech companies. A few years ago, Børsen and Politiken wanted to merger, and there were good reasons why that shouldn't happen, because they would become a very large player in the market. So they were told no. They could not merge. But if we want a chance, I don't think they would have stood a chance, but shouldn't they be allowed to do it? That is an example of reality meeting the positive thought and the good intentions. And we as population, we will lose if we don't make the difficult decisions in the short term. That was putting the spotlight on you, Jakob, and we are enforcing the same laws. So when I was able to fine Apple 1.84 billion euros, then it is the same laws we are adhering to and enforcing. So we have a very close collaboration, and we have interesting discussions in our network about the greater good. And there are some questions here from our audience. Markus Heusbro is asking, a lot of you are talking about increasing financial growth. And we want to grow in a world with endless resources. So how can we ensure the good life and natural capital in that context? And Frederick is asking, how can we use competition policy to ensure the green transition in Europe? So the entire climate question is a question about the greater good. How do we achieve the greater good? And how or which role does competition policy play in that?
Yes, well, first of all, there was the question about mergers. We are in charge of merger control. If a merger between two companies weakens competition to the detriment of consumers, we have to say no. Or otherwise, the companies in question need to make sure that this does not damage competition. And there are examples of mergers not being approved. And that is always because it's to the detriment of consumers in the EU or in Denmark, or it will damage other companies. And it could also be because there is not any will from those companies to make sure that they do not damage competition. That is always the consideration. And we also need to consider if there are any synergies. And we really like it when mergers give rise to synergies. And we say, please do, go ahead. But we need to make that decision and make that assessment. And they need to, of course, document that those benefits are real. And on the question of sustainability, a very important role for us in that connection is to welcome the demand that we're seeing today for sustainable. Many also public authorities are demanding sustainable products, and private citizens are also demanding sustainable products. So there is a strong basis for a good competition between companies when it comes to delivering the best sustainable productions. And that is our role, to ensure that that competition is not weakened. And the Competition Council has also said that we want to avoid agreements between companies limiting the competition for climate-friendly and green products. That is very, very important. The other thing is that our moderator today from DG Competition has drawn up new guidelines published recently about sustainable agreements within the framework of competition policy. In that guideline, you can read that there are opportunities and that there is a margin for certain types of agreements that can underpin sustainability. And finally, I would like to say it is not our role or the role of competition policy to ensure the transition of the agricultural sector or the redistribution of wealth in society. We're quite happy that our mandate is very limited to the focus on competition and the framework for competition, and that it is a matter for politicians whether they want to make use of other tools to ensure the green transition. And I think many people would be upset if we were to discuss whether we wanted green transition here or there, or we can see that people are affected by this in northern Jutland. Let's kind of tweak the rules so that we can benefit them. That wouldn't be realistic. We like that we have a very well-limited mandate. Yes, and it can be difficult. A few years ago, I also have a limited mandate, and a few years ago we had a case where a company producing the fiber used for cigarette filters, they wanted to do a merger. That would result in a very big market share, and some people asked us, well, can't you just shrug it off? Because if those filters become more expensive, then cigarettes will become more expensive and fewer people will smoke. Wouldn't that be a good idea? Yes, I said, well, perhaps cigarettes should be more expensive, but they shouldn't become more expensive because we turn a blind eye to a monopoly in this market. It should be because politicians say consciously, we want cigarettes to be more expensive. And then it should be based on taxes or levies that will go to the state coffers. Because as soon as we put these false eggs into our basket, then we do not have the sufficient transparency in order to make these decisions. The same goes for the aviation industry. Some people think that we should fly a lot less. Should we just turn a blind eye to monopolies or cartels? I'm sure many of you have seen how prices have gone up and the number of flights has gone down after the pandemic. Should we just sit on our hands and say that's all well and good because there's a climate benefit to this development? And here I think that could be your new job. You could host a podcast called Margrethe and the Monopoly. Well, I think there should be a distance between us who enforce competition law and then the politicians who make strategic decisions. And I'm sure that that is something you consider as well, Michael, and then Nina afterwards.
Could I just return to the question from before? Of course. Somehow, your question is not related to competition, and in another way, it is related to competition. Because competition is good in terms of creating optimum use of resources, and is that bad for sustainability? No, it has nothing to with sustainability to do. But if we increase the emissions or it hurts biodiversity, then yes, but it has nothing with competition. It has nothing to do with competition. If we have the lowest costs and we distribute the yield, then no. But in other ways, it is related because there are some external factors that play a role. And what I've spent a lot of time on these last 3 years is the climate, because I was looking at CO2 taxes on industries. And I've also looked at agriculture, because it's difficult, because the farmers are so angry all the time. But we've looked into it, and what is interesting is that in agriculture, what is not energy-related emissions, then it would be then it will correspond to 50% of the emissions in Denmark. It's a large percentage, and no country in the world will regulate these emissions from agriculture. So our question is should Denmark be the first country to do so? Our response would be yes, of course. We should lead the way, and we should regulate agriculture. And then the farmers would say, well, they would ask an economist how to do it. And the economist would say we would need a tax on emissions, and you would have to pay that tax. And they would say if we have to pay a tax, then it would be a disadvantage for us in terms of competition, and that would mean we produce less, they would produce more, and there would be no climate effect. Because they don't care if the emission is in Skjern in Denmark or in Poland. And that is correct. And how do you solve that issue? The fact that you want to be world leading and you want to get the farmers to bring down their emissions. And economists would say, could we motivate the farmers and say it is too expensive with these emissions? And then we could provide the funds, and we would give them a deduction, a tax deduction. We would motivate them to reduce their emissions, but they would get the deduction. So in principle, if they don't emit and they get the deduction, they could earn money if it was free to bring down the emissions. And then the EU says, that's good, you want to be world leading, but you cannot subsidize these farmers. You cannot give them more than 80% of the overall deduction. And then we talk about growth and climate being related. That's not competition law. It is state funding. These are two different aspects. I'm an economist. What do I know? But the point is the same. It's a way of reducing competition. So somehow, the point is that there is a question of how do we get some climate gains and still have free competition. In that case, they could be opposites. Does that make sense? It is very interesting how you solve that issue. Now I have 51 minutes. That's very good. To Nina's point before, and she was asking a question to Jakob, couldn't you assume your role as a commissioner and tell us what should the EU do? You can't be the moderator all day. No, it's just a test. And we need more tests for this to be really good. What was the question? I was just warming up. It's a great honor to have such a great personality here present. Oh, the irony. But the entire discussion of what role the EU plays in this industrial havoc. Can you talk a bit about that? Or consider it? First of all, a dialogue with agriculture. We have some rules where you, in principle, can give agriculture and farmers money. So you could have a scheme that is asymmetrical. You could give them de minimis and give them an amount that corresponds to what they pay in taxes. But if it is larger than that, you can give them full compensation, but that will give a competitive disadvantage. So you could play with the elements of the state funding, because the small actor in the market doesn't have the same effect in the market as the larger part. The other thing we look at in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, and it has nothing to do with fighting inflation, it does entail some competition elements, because they would like lower prices on hearing aids or internet prices. In the US, the government is occupied with having more competition because the American market is more concentrated than the European market is. So it's not just the competition authorities in the United States that are being asked. It's also other authorities that are being asked, how can we have more competition? Because Americans are paying too much for a lot of products. They don't have this European debate. The European debate says that couldn't we just talk about competition? And in the States, a lot of people are just taking it for granted. And then you could get a tax deduction if you do certain things. So it is like broad-spectred penicillin. It would end up in our waters anyway. So what we've done is that we look at specific contexts where it is a bit too tempting to go to the US. It is good to go to the US while you're also investing in Europe, because you'll gain access to the American market, which is good for European companies. But if it's either or, We have figured out that you can match the subsidy that you are getting. One company has gained 902 million euros to build a company here in Denmark. You could also have a dumping station where you can have certain projects and give subsidies up to 100 million euros if it's in Denmark, and up to 150 million euros if you really need growth in that particular area. And then they would say, okay, 100 million, and we don't need to call Brussels. And then you'll have that pace that we need. But the other element is that we cannot spend the same amount of money as the Americans, but we can set the competition rules for having a business in Europe. We could have access to qualified employees, good subsidy environments, governments that are not corrupt, good infrastructure, the single market, good digital infrastructure, and a security for people living in the area. You can come from abroad, you can attract employees, and you can live in a safe way. So we're looking at a lot of various aspects instead of thinking that we need a silver bullet to solve everything. My worry is that there are two silver bullets that are very crucial. One silver bullet is political willingness. We need the willingness to make sure that we are upscaling all of us. You can't just reduce the aid for university educations. We need to make sure that people have the basic digital competences. We have set aside many funds for this area, and we haven't seen the progress we wanted. So one silver bullet is the political willingness, and the other silver bullet is confidence, saying we can make this work. We need the same attitude as they have in Jutland. We will make this happen. That would make a difference. And now I'm back to being the moderator. I pass the floor to Nina.
And I will do what Michael did as well. I will ask a question back to you, Margrethe. Because, and you said what you try to do from Brussels and the big players in the market, and I understand all of that. And it really made a lot of sense in a different age. It makes me quite concerned when you're talking about well-educated populations. I mean, I want to live in Europe. I'm not going to live in India or China where a central government can just decide we want a wind farm here and a poisonous battery factory there, and that things will just go ahead. That's how they do things elsewhere. The problem just is that we are setting out the course for the next 100 years, and they will look quite different from the past 100 years. And the winner takes it all in the current shape of the world. And that is somewhat uncomfortable, because if we do not win, then what? And AI and the tech industry and the green transition, these are the big drivers. And we want the green transition to be ours. And there's no doubt that the EU is the most ambitious player in the world in this regard. But can we find the big solutions? We don't have any big tech giants in Europe. I don't think we've lost that race already. And again, the winner takes it all, those who are first with the solutions. So my question to you, Margrethe, is, now you have been working with competition policy for 10 years in the EU, and talking about the size of companies and these tech giants. Of course, we want free competitions and fair prices, and they can't get too big. And what do we really want? But it all comes down to, do you want to set the agenda? Do you want to be in charge? Do you want to be the ones who roll this out to the rest of the world? From Europe, we don't roll out very much to the rest of the world. ways of government or values or anything, and that's kind of sad. Maybe that's a big question. Now I need you to be super optimistic and tell me that I'm too much of a pessimist here. Well, in the old days, when I was on the late news, then you would always ask me a question and I would say, I don't accept the premise of that question. And that is partially the case here. However, with a bit of nuance, because the question about AI, this is a battle that hasn't been lost. The race is not over. The European public sector is half of the European economy, and they use AI to deliver public services because we trust that these authorities can do it in a proper way, so that consumers can have trust in the way we use these tools. So it's not quite true. You don't have to use ChatGPT or whatever it is. You can do tailor-made solutions. A Danish hospital created a scheme where they fed an AI with 76,000 patient records for gastrointestinal disease. And they almost halved the complications that came up due to this kind of treatment. And that has been super helpful because then you can teach others how to feed the AI with their patient records because their gastrointestinal diseases may develop in a different way in another area. So we can't just sit back and say, oh, the other ones are ahead of us, so now we will just go home and draw up some tourist brochure so that people can visit Europe as this traditional, almost outdoors museum that it has become. But of course we should be aware that we don't think that we're on top of the world and everybody wants to be like us, because that is not the case. That's not a way of gaining friends. You should reach out instead and ask people to collaborate with us. And culturally, it's very hard to de-learn our previous preconceptions because other parts of the world have good ideas too. It's not non-European, it's just a variation of what we believe in. People continue to escape and flee towards democracies and welfare societies and press freedom. They don't escape the other way. Sofie, you wanted to say something. Yes, well, there was a good question about industry. If growth continues, then what? And that's a very good question. And a very urgent question that many people ask. And it taps into this entire discussion of whether we're the best in Europe. We are not anymore, and we need to understand that in many different fields. But we still get a lot of good ideas, just as they do in the rest of the world, and we hire people from abroad in Danish companies, and we would love it for it not to be so cumbersome. So we are very, very good at making our ideas reality out in our companies, because that is in the companies that this happens, that this transition from ideas to reality happens. The companies are the ones who can solve many of the green challenges that we are facing. And I represent the companies who have solutions for bringing down the CO2, strengthening our biodiversity. And these ideas should get out there and start working. They can start working in the US and in the Middle East or in China. That's great. We just need these ideas to go out and start working in reality and in Europe as well. And we want to see that the rules and the implementation of the rules is not hindering this development too much. It doesn't mean that these companies shouldn't make money, because if they didn't make money, they wouldn't exist. So we need to support growth. I don't believe that these ideas will be realized if we can't make these companies thrive vis-a-vis this discussion of the invisible hand, because innovation happens best at universities and in companies. We need to get our ideas across into reality, and We shouldn't interfere too much because that can limit the creation of ideas. But of course, regulators should be able to say, we want more of this, not particularly this particular thing or item, but we want more green transition, and then we should be willing to support that development. And that leads me back to agriculture, because I represent companies who can produce milk protein without cows. But now that we are subsidizing the cows heavily in the EU, it's difficult to compete. The cow is heavily subsidized. They really get a load of money with each cow from the EU to be able to produce milk and meat for all of us. That used to be a good idea. But now that we have alternatives that do not get any subsidies at all and that are very, very expensive to develop, then what do we need in order for them to come to market? Can I just ask a question for the entire panel, please? Do you believe that in Europe we are agile enough to do these crazy transitions that you are pointing out here, Sofie? You're saying we have the money, we have the technology, we need to turn around this supertanker. We need to change something. And Michael, you wrote an entire report about things that should look different. And you have to decide that somewhere, and it will hurt someone. And it's not nice to lose something, even if you are being given something else instead. Of course, you thought you were a farmer, but you have to do something else now. And we will support you in that. Can we do that? Do you believe we can do that? And can we change the regulation that is current?
It is possible, but not within the regulations that we already have. We have to change those because the entire world is changing. I think that if I had been a politician, I'm no longer a politician, that the Commission would also have to play a role. And my role is also to say to the companies, you have to help politicians and others to get people on board the green transition, and that we need to speed it up. As was also mentioned in the beginning by the Pro-Rector, we have to stand together if we want the green transition to succeed. If we want Europe to not be an outdoors museum, we have to all get on board that journey. But people might feel, what about their jobs? And when are they left behind? We can't just say companies will do their part, politicians will do their part. There are people in between. And there are people that need to have that dialogue. But of course, Europe is able to do it. And there's a campaign here in Denmark for the election in the European Parliament, and you will read it if you're in Brussels. It says, political time is running out, with an hourglass, but it could also be turned around and read backwards. And it represented an opportunity for Europe. So in the Confederation of Danish Industries, we believe that we can do it. And we can say that we are an exhibition and we have the opportunity to trade with the rest of the world, but time is running out. Let's include Jakob in this question. You know the markets in Denmark, you know how they work, and as you say, the work is not done. To Nina's point, can we speed it up so that we can address the global competition? I think the question you raised circled around us going in a green direction, controlling climate change and what that requires. And I think it is a political decision and it is about regulation, first and foremost. Of course, there could be state funding included in that. I cannot reject that. But it is not suitable for bringing us in that direction. It is not an instrument that is very beneficial. There are other tools that you might be able to use. Michael? Yes, I'm from Jutland, and I live in the most wonderful place in the world, and I'm an optimist. And it was also the best place in the world 100 years ago. And the question is, will it be the best place in the world in 100 years from now? We have the world's best university, the best students, the best professors, the best commissioners. Of course, there are threats. So we need more subsidies for the universities, yes. I want to go back to the discussion on what Biden is doing, and if it's the smart way to do things, we can do something that is smarter, and we are doing that. So where are we in the race of the green transition? I don't think that it will leave us in a poorer place. I think that we can do things in a smarter way because we are more smart. AI is included. It is supposed to transform our entire society. And are we ready for that? And the EU, not that I know everything about it, but you have also made a regulation that makes it possible to operate in that context. We are the fastest in including the things that are thrown at us. We are the most tech-savvy in the world. The Danes. I don't know if they are in Portugal and other places, but if we could be the most savvy in all their areas, it would be great. The challenges are great because there is the entire discussion about strategical autonomy, that you want to do everything yourself, and that goes against all that has brought prosperity and given us a comparative advantage. Now we want to do things ourselves, but that is also a misunderstanding. We need to do what is necessary. It is important that we have food. It is also important that we have energy if Vladimir Putin all of a sudden decides to cut us off. And there are certain things that might be too far from us at the moment, and we can bring them back. But the question is, in which areas do we do it? But we need to be upfront and be ready to adopt it. And I think we are there. Nina. In terms of the Danes, I don't think I'm so pessimistic. We are very tech-savvy. We're ready to use everything. We're smart and we're agile. But I am looking at Europe as a whole and as one unity if we're going up against other global agendas. And I think we have the elections in the European Parliament coming up, and the debate today is called Markets for People. And my concern is, do we include the people in all of these ideas and thoughts? Are people ready to do something else than what they're doing today? It is everyday life we're talking about, and jobs and families, and what we're all concerned about when we get up in the morning. And it is not nice when something is rocking the boat and everything is insecure and there is war in the world. And that is my concern, that if we as a people are not included, are we well informed and do we grasp the overall context? That is my concern. And there might be some gaps between the correct ideas, the correct thoughts, but it is more difficult when you have to implement it in everyday life. I would like to be the one saying, after everyone shouting, Denmark, Denmark, I would like to be the one saying there are other good countries out there. Not as efficient as Denmark, least of all Aarhus. But there are startup environments in Paris where they are speaking English. Who would have thought? Greece has one of the most dynamic economies in the world today. despite them going through some very tough years. In Sicily, they have one of the most advanced environments of producing microchips, not just the production of microchips, but also the packaging, because you have to cut it into small parts that are less than a string of hair. So we can do many things in Europe. But I would like to come back to my silver bullets, one being political willingness and the other being confidence. We use these to get things done. If you remember, during the pandemic, we had a common vaccine program, and we got the vaccines rolled out at a record pace, and we wanted a full approval of the vaccines. Otherwise, the risk would be somebody saying, well, this is just an emergency situation. This is not very good. I don't want it. So we wanted a full approval. Normally, you would say to the medical companies, you can do your trials, and once you've finished, you can put your data in boxes and move them to Brussels, and then afterwards, we'll look at all the data again. But that wasn't the way to do it. Every day in your trial process, if you have data that is ready, you should ship them off to us immediately. So on the last day, when you've sent the last data and we've looked at the data, we will be ready with the final conclusion, an assessment. And we achieved the fastest assessment ever. And we can be inspired by that, because a lot of this is about speed in doing things, but still having the confidence in how things work. Because our European model is that we want confidence in how things work, because that is the reason why things are going quite well. We're talking about a lot about a balance, and I have two questions that are about the same thing. The first one is from Bo. He asks, after the financial crisis, we were setting a lot of requirements for the solvency of banks. But you are not as strict in terms of competition and the banks. And the other question is concerning the wish about more public collaborations and gathering expertise from different industries to create efficient solutions. So it's more or less the same questions. They are about the balance between competition and societal requirements. Can we strike that balance? You would be the first one to comment on that. It's not very easy. If we start with the banks, I think there was a good reason to tighten the regulation on banks after the financial crisis. We looked into the capital requirements, and they are quite uniform and sensible, and I don't think they are a hindrance for competition. We're not too occupied with that at the moment. There are a lot of other aspects that are more interesting to us if we think about competition. And in terms of the public and private collaboration, I don't know. I think the question was if it weakens competition, if there is a collaboration between the public sector and the private sector. We are financing the education sector, health sector, and we think that everyone is entitled to the same fair treatment. In Bornholm, they were experimenting with their own treatment for breast cancer. And the Danish health authorities put a stop to that experiment. So we have some societal considerations, because there are things that we finance with state aid. But when you look at logic, and if it makes sense, you might go in a different direction. And what happens with competition in that context?
Well, public authorities have a requirement that they must put things out to tender. Under certain circumstances, they must initiate a tender procedure, and then private companies can bid. And there can be good reasons for that, and that can really benefit society if you make sure that the companies participating do not gain exclusive rights and that nobody is treated better than others. But I don't think we have had a lot of success with these public-private partnerships in Denmark. We have a group called FOBS where we have players from the purchasing side and the order giver's side, where you have this dialogue about how to do this, how can you be ambitious in this field, all the while ensuring that competition works well and that everything is transparent and so on. So we're working on it. And Michael? Yes, well, to the first question, well, that's what I've been trying to say all along, that there are these balances we need to strike. We want competition because I've said all of the benefits before. It gives a good allocation of resources. And then sometimes there's a market error, and we saw that with the financial sector. One of it was the moral hazard, that financial companies could assume a lot of risk, and then if it went wrong, then they were bailed out by Sofie and Margrethe back when you were in Danish politics. We can't let you go down, and then you will use twice the Danish GDP to bail out the banks. So here it really makes sense to regulate the sector in a better way. And then you need to find the right level of capital requirements and how it should vary according to the variations of the economy. But what we saw with the pandemic, we had these very well-bolstered banks, and that meant that there was no crisis in the financial sector due to this health crisis. And that was a stroke of luck for the rest of us, because it wasn't accompanied by a credit freeze or a housing crisis. You could still borrow money. That was great. Was it because of regulation? We don't know, but it really had a beneficial effect. And that might be detrimental to competition, but that is the balance you need to strike. Yeah, well, the way we did it, without being able to remember all the details, we needed to increase the capital requirements, and the smaller the bank, the bigger the capital requirements. And of course, we had these market error considerations, and this regulation might lead to imbalances in the system. It's true, and there's a lot of registration requirements. Of course, small banks have a difficult time adhering to these rules. And then the question is, could you do it like the EU with differentiated rules? And I don't know the rules in detail either, but again, it's about finding the right balance here. And you can if you're good at it. And then just one question about consolidation, whether that weakens the competition in the sector, because we've been considering that. Of course, you might envisage that if there are fewer players in the market, you have less competition. But on the other hand, if you have fewer bigger players and more aggressive players that are more skillful, it might pull in the other direction. So competition may change according to the setup of the market. And you really just need two players competing in a fierce way, but we want more players in the market. Right now we have a lot. Compared to other countries, we have a lot of banks in Denmark.
Hvis der kun er to.
If there are only two, then the probability of them coordinating prices is very high. I can show you that they can do so. Sofie? We've achieved a lot of good from public-private partnerships. The pandemic was a good example, or how we managed the pandemic, because we have gained a lot from the public-private partnerships, new products, new solutions, and we acted much faster and we saved lives, literally. The concern from the industries is that the public shouldn't take over private tasks, and we could have gained in more jobs, new solutions, new earnings, because it might be less transparent which which funds are actually subsidizing it. So it's very good if it's transparent and clear. Nina. I used to work in the finance sector. I just wanted to flag that. And I think it was very good for the sector and Denmark that it was scaled down in size. I think we have fewer banks than what we had in 2007. I don't think that the solvency was the trigger, but my feeling is that it is a back office and legislation and the entire know your customer that was essential. There is an extreme amount of regulation, and we need a very good back office to navigate that. And I think it was a very good situation for the society as a whole, no doubt. But what I also hear is that in the finance sector, they think that it is a bit too heavy. There is too much regulation. They are saying that they want more simplified rules. I often hear that. And Margrethe, it seems like it is becoming more and more complex. And that might be a hindrance in Europe. We need to simplify the rules. I don't know. That is what the finance sector is saying. And it is something that is easy to say, but it might be more difficult to implement. My experience is that in terms of more simplified rules, I feel that they are more brutal. There's less of a gray area, and a lot of people are caught in the rules. And then politicians will say, that's a shame, and they will come up with a tiny rule that could bring along the rest. But then there's still a limit. But they might expand it a bit more. And that way, the world becomes much more complicated. And we are competing a lot on things that are unfair. And that creates complexity. So if we want simplified rules, it will be more brutal. Some people will be left behind because they cannot follow the simple rule. And we have been moving in the opposite direction the last few years. We want nuances. We want smooth transitions. We don't want for people to be left behind completely. I was responsible of a trust reform. There will always be somebody that will not comply with the rules, and we cannot come up with rules that can encompass everyone. So let's get rid of some of the rules. And that was doable. And we talked with people who had crazy rules. We looked at all the crazy rules and said, okay, are we ready? Let's get rid of them. But then somebody would say, I came up with that rule. That's a good rule. And another person would say, I came up with that rule, and that's also very good. So we ended up with nothing, because every rule has a sponsor. Everyone will have a rule made up for their sake. And we were picking all the rules and looking into every single one. But it is going against our nature, basically. So we can't just pick the rules from the top. We have to take our time and analyze what is it we want in this particular area, because that is the only way of coming up with a new structure. And in that way, we can strike the right balance, because all rules are an expression of interests. And we want to make those interests legitimate. And that is what makes it difficult, because there will be a lot of people who are thinking about biodiversity and who might get concerned because there are rules for industry to be able to construct, but we also have to consider biodiversity. We've talked a little bit about the Danish market and the European market. And there is a question here, and we have time for it, from Kasper Olsen. Said the single market is especially good for growth in Europe. Are you for expanding Europe with more member states? Will that distort the competition between the member states? There are a lot of dimensions included in an expansion, but is a greater market better than smaller markets? We could ask England how they felt when they left the European Union. Apart from soccer, it is not a good place to live. But seriously speaking, what is the best size of the single market? So the question is if it's an advantage or disadvantage to enter the single market. Financially speaking, it's not an advantage. There will continuously be more and more member states, and a lot of people have measured the effect of the single market, and they reached the same conclusion. It is a financial advantage to enter the single market. But the question is, what does that mean? Financially speaking, you have free mobility, access to capital, and no protectionism. So that's all the good parts when it comes to competition. And in that sense, we want less protectionism, but that's on a world scale. So I would say the answer is yes, a greater market. Sofie? From the company's perspective, there's no doubt we want a larger market with uniform rules. That would be good. But the question is, how is it enforced? Is it transparent? Do we understand it the same way? Because otherwise, there will be competition legislation, there will be fraud, people cheating, states playing a role that you can't really see through as a company. So we have to look at the values and the framework and the understanding of the market, but also the democracies or the lack of democracies. So it is a question of striking the balance between the advantages and disadvantages. But overall, it's been a huge benefit for Danish companies and Danes to be part of a more harmonized single market. And there is a great difference between the Commission doing an act or a directive that could be interpreted in many different ways in the different member states. So a complete single market, we're not there yet.
And again, you can look it up. It's a good idea on paper, but you should always make sure that you have the population with you. Also, when it comes to the mental mindset and the free movement of people and services, and people wanting to be part of this amazing club. So just to flag that it might look good in a spreadsheet, but are the people ready to invite more people in to be one big family? And sometimes when I look out over the landscape, I might have doubts. Well, the difference between a family and the EU, in a family you will bear with each other. There's always a cousin who will cheat when you're playing a card game. You know that. But here it's more a matter of saying, this is a club. There are rules. You have signed up to a certain set of rules. And therefore, this cannot only be a question of the markets, because as Sofie says, what kind of culture do you bring to the table when it comes to law enforcement? But you know our European colleagues quite well when it comes to whether there is a uniform law enforcement, because Sofie is right that when in the Commission we're looking at countries and how they transpose European law into national law, we are becoming ever more concerned, because this is about, should we do a new law inspired by Europe? Then we will open a drawer and then we will add this and that and the other. And then all of a sudden, you can't really recognize this law in its initial form, and you will end up with 27 different laws. And therefore, we continue to lean more towards regulations where you don't need to transpose it into national law. And I'm asking you, because Sofie says one thing is to have a single market with uniform rules, but is it enforced in the same way? I don't always attend all the meetings in our European network, but will you see the Nordic countries sort of nudging the other people saying, well, in Greece they really don't understand competition law? Well, what I tried to say is that there's quite a uniform approach in this network as to how to enforce these rules and how you look at competition in general. And the overall aim is to underpin a well-functioning single market. And in recent years, we have seen initiatives, as you were the head of, where you improved the framework for enforcing competition law around Europe, so as to mainstream the way things were working. But of course there might be different constellations and different setups in different countries. In some countries the authorities will be less independent than in others, but it is my clear impression that there is a common wish to enforce in a uniform way across the EU. And when we open a case with a cross-border element, then we will talk to the Commission. And if the Commission thinks that we are wrong, then we can stop the case right there. So there is a sort of checks and balances in the system that ensures quite a uniform enforcement, and I think that works quite well. And now we have talked on an assumption that we are talking about goods and services that we can transport within our single market. One of the first mergers I worked with was about cement in Croatia. And cement is quite expensive to transport, particularly if you are going across a mountain chain. And it appeared that the mountain chain that forms part of Croatia kind of cuts the Croatian cement market into two. And we ended up disapproving that merger because it would have meant that one part of Croatia would have much more expensive cement than another part of Croatia. And thinking about a delicious Mars bar, it has been produced by some people combining different products. And one of these products is liquid chocolate. And that is produced in one factory, and then it is transported in trucks. And it will be transported, if it's transported more than 500 kilometers, then the product will deteriorate. That's just a fun fact from the reality of law enforcement. And that is why we don't have a European market for liquid chocolate, for biscuits and Mars bar and whatnot, because it doesn't travel very well. So there are all of these different considerations that you need to take into account. It also has to do with the geography of the single market and the quality of products. Can they even be produced so far away? And let me tell you that one of the things that I may have done wrong is that I have read out the questions that have been put to us here in the room, but perhaps someone here wants the final word. Someone might want to actually take the floor and stand up and say, I have the question we should have been discussing all along. So please, go ahead. That does not seem to be the case. Then perhaps Margrethe. Nobody dares to ask the question. So I think the question is, what are you going to do next, Margrethe? Isn't that the question? People are nodding out there. Well, I think we can all agree that I shouldn't be a moderator. No, we don't agree at all. You could have a radio program called Margrethe and the Monopoly, and it should be all about competition policy. No, well, I said to the government that if they can't find a better Danish commissioner, I will be available, of course. But if they can, then I need to find something else to do. Well, yes, you do. And, well, I contributed to raising the age of retirement, so I can't just chicken out and say, well, I'm just retiring and going home. But the truth is, I don't know yet. And I usually say to those who ask me that you will be the first to know, me and the viewers. But perhaps the reason is that I saw that refreshments were being set out outside, and now we have had this whole tour de force of perspectives on whether to weaken or strengthen competition and in what kind of geographical area and what kind of limitations are put on the effectiveness of competition vis-à-vis our goals within health and education and climate, and of course geopolitics that we also really touched upon. And I think this panel really deserves a huge round of applause.
Ja. Klapper altid. Så laver man noget, mens folk klapper.
And while you enjoy the refreshments outside the room, you can look forward to revisiting this whole panel debate online. And we will also have a recap in these short 2 to 3 minute videos if you want a short recap afterwards. Thank you to all of the listeners and participants. Thank you to the hosts. We are very grateful that we could be here at Aarhus University today. And now that Professor Eika mentioned Adam Smith in her introduction, I mean, economists couldn't be more happy, could they? Thank you very much for participating today.